Hello everyone, and welcome back to Chill and Feel Chronicles. Wherever you are in the world, I'm truly glad you're here. Before we step back more than 1,000 years, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always incredible to see history bringing together people from every corner of the globe. And if you enjoy slow, immersive journeys into the past, don't forget to subscribe to Chill and Feel Chronicles and join us for many more adventures through history. Now, close your eyes for a moment and picture the first light of dawn touching the steep cliffs of a Norwegian fjord. The sea is perfectly still, reflecting a sky painted in soft shades of gold and blue. A thin layer of mist drifts across the water as the sleepy Viking village slowly awakens. Smoke curls gently from the roofs of weathered longhouses, carrying the comforting scent of burning birch wood into the crisp, northern air. Inside, the day has already begun. A mother stirs a pot of warm oat porridge over an open fire while fresh barley bread cools on a wooden table. Nearby, strips of dried cod hang from the rafters, waiting to become part of a nourishing soup. Children gather around the hearth, and outside, fishermen prepare their boats while farmers lead animals into dew-covered fields. There are no grand banquets, no endless drinking halls filled with roasted boars, only ordinary people beginning another day in one of the harshest environments on earth. But what did Vikings really eat every single day? Did they feast on meat as often as the legends would have us believe? And how did entire communities survive the endless winters of Scandinavia? When the ground froze solid, daylight became scarce, and fresh food almost disappeared. The answer may surprise you. Behind every loaf of bread, every bowl of soup, and every piece of dried fish lay generations of knowledge, careful planning, and remarkable resilience. Viking food was never simply about satisfying hunger, it was about surviving unpredictable seasons, making every harvest last, and turning limited resources into enough to feed an entire family through months of darkness and bitter cold. Tonight, we'll step beyond the myths of horned helmets and legendary feasts. We'll walk into the kitchens of Viking longhouses, sail alongside fishermen on icy northern seas, follow farmers through short but precious summers, and uncover the real meals that fueled explorers, traders, craftsmen, and warriors alike. This is the untold story of Viking food, not the meals of legend, but the meals that made the Viking world possible. Long before the Vikings became famous as fearless sailors and legendary warriors, they were something far more familiar: families trying to put food on the table in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in Europe. To understand what the Vikings ate, we must first understand the land that fed them. Because in Scandinavia, nature decided the menu long before any cook lit a fire. Stretching across what we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the Viking world was a place of striking beauty, but also constant challenge. Towering mountains rose sharply from the sea, dense forests covered vast stretches of land, and thousands of deep fjords carved dramatic paths through the coastline. During summer, the landscape could seem almost magical, with endless daylight encouraging crops to grow. Yet that season was painfully short. Winter always returned. As autumn faded, temperatures dropped rapidly. Snow blanketed the valleys, lakes froze solid, and icy winds swept in from the North Atlantic. In many northern settlements, daylight shrank to only a few precious hours. For months, the ground remained frozen, making farming nearly impossible. Every family understood a simple truth: whatever food had not been gathered before winter would almost certainly not exist until spring. Unlike the fertile plains of southern Europe, Scandinavia offered surprisingly little farmland. Rocky hills, thin soil, and steep mountain slopes meant that only a small percentage of the land could be cultivated. Farmers carefully cleared stones from their fields year after year, working tirelessly to grow hardy crops such as barley, oats, and rye. Wheat, which required richer soil and a warmer climate, was a luxury that many Viking families rarely enjoyed. Because the growing season often lasted only a few short months, every harvest mattered. A single season of poor weather could threaten an entire community. Too much rain could rot the grain before it ripened. An early frost could destroy vegetables overnight. Even a late spring might delay planting long enough to reduce the harvest before winter returned. Fortunately, the Vikings possessed something just as valuable as fertile soil. They had the sea. Few civilizations in history lived as closely connected to the ocean as the Norse people. Nearly every village stood beside a river, a lake, or the sheltered waters of a fjord. The sea was not a barrier, it was their highway, their marketplace, and one of their greatest sources of food. Fishing became part of everyday life. Cod, herring, salmon, trout, and many other species filled their nets throughout much of the year. Along the shoreline they gathered shellfish, while seabirds provided both eggs and meat during nesting seasons. The ocean often supplied food when the fields could not, but even the sea could not be trusted completely. Storms might prevent boats from leaving shore for days or even weeks. Harsh winters sometimes covered fishing grounds with ice or made voyages too dangerous. Once again, survival depended on preparation rather than luck. This reality shaped one of the defining features of Viking life, preserving food for the future. Fresh meat, fish, milk, and vegetables could never be relied upon throughout the year. Instead, nearly every household became an expert in making food last. Fish were hung on wooden racks where cold northern winds slowly transformed them into hard, dry stockfish that could remain edible for months. Meat was salted or smoked over slow-burning fires. Dairy products were turned into butter and cheese that kept far longer than fresh milk. Vegetables were dried, while berries were preserved whenever possible. Grain was stored carefully inside barns, protected from moisture and hungry rodents. These methods were not occasional practices, they were essential skills passed from one generation to the next. Every summer was, in many ways, a race against the coming winter. Every successful harvest, every full smokehouse, and every barrel of preserved food represented security for the months ahead. In the Viking world, a well-stocked pantry could be just as valuable as a sharp sword. The environment demanded patience, planning, and remarkable resourcefulness. It taught the Norse people never to waste food, never to take abundance for granted, and always to prepare for seasons when nature offered very little in return. As we continue our journey, we'll discover how these harsh conditions influenced not only what the Vikings ate, but also how they cooked, shared meals, and built a food culture that allowed them to thrive in one of the world's most challenging landscapes. The first rays of sunlight have only just begun to slip through the smoke hole in the roof of a Viking longhouse. Outside, the village is quiet except for the distant cries of seabirds and the gentle splush of waves against wooden boats. Inside, however, the day is already underway. A fire has been burning throughout the night, its glowing embers carefully protected beneath a layer of ash. Rather than starting a new fire each morning, a difficult task in damp Scandinavian weather, the family simply feeds the coals with fresh birch and pine. Soon, the room fills with the comforting crackle of burning wood and the familiar aroma of breakfast. Unlike the lavish feasts often shown in films, a Viking breakfast was usually simple, filling, and practical. It was not a meal designed to impress. It was designed to provide enough energy for a long day of demanding physical work. The most common breakfast was a warm bowl of porridge. Made from oats or barley, the grains were slowly simmered in water or milk inside a heavy iron pot suspended over the fire. There were no instant recipes, no refined cereals, and certainly no sugar. Preparing breakfast required patience. The porridge thickened gradually as it absorbed the liquid, becoming hearty enough to satisfy hungry farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and children alike. Depending on the family's fortunes, The porridge might be flavored with wild berries gathered during summer, crushed hazelnuts collected from nearby forests, or a small spoonful of precious honey. Honey was the closest thing the Vikings had to a natural sweetener, and because producing it required keeping bees, it was never wasted. Most mornings, however, the porridge was plain, yet plain did not mean undesirable. For people who expected to spend the entire day rowing fishing boats, tending livestock, cutting timber, weaving cloth, or working iron, a warm bowl of grain was dependable fuel. Rich in carbohydrates and surprisingly nutritious, it provided steady energy that could last for hours. Beside the porridge sat another familiar sight: dark, dense bread. Unlike the soft white loaves found in modern bakeries, Viking bread was coarse and heavy. It was commonly made from barley, rye, or oats, since wheat struggled to grow in Scandinavia's harsh climate. The grain was ground using stone querns, producing flour that often contained tiny fragments of grit. Eating bread sometimes meant chewing carefully to avoid wearing down one's teeth even faster than daily life already did. The dough itself was uncomplicated. Mixed with water and occasionally sourdough starters that had been preserved from previous batches, it was baked on flat stones, iron griddles, or directly over the hearth. The result was a rustic loaf with a thick crust and a dense interior that stayed edible for several days. A piece of fresh bread rarely remained dry for long. Butter was one of the household's greatest treasures. Milk from cows or goats was churned by hand until rich, yellow butter formed. During the warmer months, much of it was salted so it could survive the long winter ahead. Spread across coarse bread, butter added precious calories that were especially valuable in a land where cold weather constantly demanded more energy from the human body. Cheese was equally important. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, particularly during summer, but turning it into cheese transformed a fragile product into food that could last for weeks or even months. Viking families produced several kinds of cheese, ranging from soft curds to harder varieties suitable for storage. Cheese could accompany breakfast, be packed for a journey, or become part of a later meal, making it one of the most practical foods in the Viking diet. Of course, breakfast needed something to drink. Fresh water was available from springs and streams, but milk often played an equally important role. Goats and cows supplied much of the household's dairy, although the amount available depended on the season and the health of the animals. Children frequently drank milk, while adults also consumed fermented dairy products that lasted longer than fresh milk and were less likely to spoil. Contrary to popular imagination, Vikings did not begin every morning drinking horns full of mead or ale. Mead was expensive because it required large amounts of honey, and strong alcoholic drinks were generally reserved for celebrations, feasts, religious gatherings, or special occasions. Everyday life demanded clear minds and steady hands, especially when dangerous work awaited outside. On fortunate mornings, breakfast included something sweeter. During summer and autumn, families gathered wild apples, berries, and other fruits wherever they could be found. Since fresh fruit disappeared quickly after harvest, much of it was dried for the colder months. Raisins obtained through trade, dried apples, or preserved berries might occasionally appear beside the morning meal, adding welcome variety to an otherwise simple table. Such treats were never guaranteed. Their appearance depended on the previous harvest, successful trade, and careful storage. Every piece of dried fruit represented planning carried out months before snow covered the landscape. As the family finishes breakfast, conversation remains brief. The day's responsibilities are already calling. Fishermen shoulder their nets before walking toward the fjord. Farmers gather tools and head into the fields. Women prepare wool for spinning, tend gardens, bake more bread, or care for young children and livestock. Even the youngest members of the household have chores to complete. The meal itself may seem modest by modern standards, but it reflects a society built upon resilience rather than excess. Every ingredient on the table, every grain of barley, every slice of bread, every pat of butter, every piece of cheese has been earned through months of labor and careful preparation. For the Vikings, breakfast was never simply the first meal of the day. It was the first reminder that survival depended not on luxury, but on wisdom, hard work, and making the very best of what the land and sea were willing to provide. If there was one food that appeared on a Viking table more often than any other, it was not roasted meat, smoked fish, or even porridge. It was bread. Simple, humble, and endlessly adaptable, bread was the foundation of everyday life throughout the Viking world. Rich or poor, farmer or fisherman, merchant or blacksmith, nearly everyone depended on it. While the ingredients and quality might differ from one household to another, bread remained a daily companion from sunrise until nightfall. To modern eyes, however, a Viking loaf would look surprisingly unfamiliar. Forget soft sandwich bread with its fluffy white interior and perfectly even slices. Viking bread was darker, denser, heavier, and far more rustic. It reflected the land from which it came, a land where survival mattered far more than appearance. The most important grain was barley. Barley was remarkably well suited to the Scandinavian climate. It tolerated cold temperatures better than wheat, matured relatively quickly during the short northern summer, and could grow in soils that were too poor for many other crops. For Viking farmers, barley was dependable, and dependability often meant survival. Every spring, families scattered barley seeds across carefully prepared fields. Throughout the brief growing season, they watched the skies anxiously. Too much rain could encourage disease. Too little rain could stunt the crop. A sudden frost arriving before harvest might destroy months of hard work in only a single night. When harvest finally came, every member of the household joined the effort. Bundles of barley were cut by hand using iron sickles, tied together, and left to dry before being carried into storage buildings. There, the grain would hopefully remain dry enough to feed the family throughout the coming year. Barley was not alone. Rye also played an important role in the Viking diet. Although it was less common in some northern regions, rye possessed one enormous advantage. It survived poor soils and harsh weather exceptionally well. Its strong roots reached deep into the earth, making it more resilient during difficult growing seasons. Bread made with rye developed a rich, slightly sour flavor and remained fresh longer than many other loaves, an important benefit in households where baking consumed both precious time and valuable firewood. Oats completed the trio of essential grains. Today, oats are often associated with breakfast cereal, but for the Vikings they served many purposes. They became porridge, animal feed, and when mixed with barley or rye flour, hearty bread. Oats added nutrition and helped stretch valuable grain supplies, especially after disappointing harvests. Very few Viking loaves relied on a single type of flour. Instead, families blended whatever grains were available. One loaf might contain mostly barley with a little rye, another might combine oats and barley. Recipes changed constantly, not because people sought culinary variety, but because they used whatever nature had provided that particular year. Even turning grain into flour demanded considerable effort. There were no windmills or electric grinders waiting to do the work. Instead, women and sometimes other family members spent countless hours kneeling beside stone querns. Grain was poured between two circular stones. The upper stone was rotated by hand while the lower remained fixed, slowly crushing kernels into coarse flour. It was exhausting work. Grinding enough flour for a single household could take several hours every week. The repetitive motion wore down muscles just as surely as it wore away the grinding stones themselves. Tiny fragments of stone often mixed with the flour, creating bread that slowly ground down people's teeth over the course of a lifetime. Archaeologists have found worn teeth on Viking skeletons that tell this silent story better than any written record. Once the flour was ready, baking could begin. Water was added to form a simple dough. Sometimes a piece of fermented dough from an earlier batch acted as a natural starter, while other loaves were baked without any leavening at all. Salt was used sparingly because it remained a valuable commodity, often obtained through trade or careful production. The dough was then shaped not into tall round loaves, but more often into flat, practical cakes. Flat bread baked quickly required less fuel and was easy to carry. For travelers, sailors and farmers spending long days away from home, it provided an ideal portable meal. A stack of flatbreads could accompany smoked fish, cheese, or butter, creating a nourishing lunch without requiring additional cooking. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Viking bread was how it was baked. Few households possessed enclosed ovens like those we know today. Instead, many families relied on the oldest cooking technology imaginable, heated stone. Large flat stones were placed directly into the fire until they absorbed intense heat. Once hot enough, the ashes were brushed aside, and flattened rounds of dough were carefully laid upon the stone's surface. The bread cooked slowly, developing a crisp outer crust while remaining dense and chewy inside. In other homes, heavy iron griddles rested over glowing embers, producing a similar result. The smell of freshly baked bread would have filled every corner of the longhouse. It mixed with wood smoke, simmering soup, drying herbs, and the earthy scent of timber walls. For Viking families, that familiar aroma meant comfort, security, and another successful day of providing for those they loved. Bread was more than food. It often served as a plate, a spoon, or even part of the cooking process itself. Thick slices could soak up rich stews, hold pieces of smoked fish, or accompany bowls of porridge. Nothing was wasted. Every crumb represented weeks of farming, hours of grinding, and precious fuel consumed during baking. To eat bread was to consume the very landscape of Scandinavia. Every loaf carried the story of rocky fields cleared by hand, uncertain harvests shaped by unpredictable weather, families working together during long summer days, and generations of knowledge passed from parent to child. It was a quiet reminder that survival in the Viking world depended not on spectacular victories or legendary raids, but on ordinary people performing ordinary tasks with extraordinary perseverance. Long before Viking ships crossed distant seas, bread had already become the true foundation of their civilization. Without it, the voyages, the settlements, and the legends that followed might never have been possible. When most people imagine a Viking feast, they picture enormous wooden tables piled high with roasted boar, venison, and endless drinking horns overflowing with mead. It is an image repeated in movies, television, and popular fiction for generations. Yet for the average Viking family, the food that truly sustained life was far less dramatic. It came from the sea. If bread formed the foundation of the Viking diet, then fish was its lifeblood. Day after day, season after season, the cold waters surrounding Scandinavia provided a dependable source of nourishment when fields failed, harvests disappointed, or livestock had to be preserved for the winter ahead. The Vikings lived beside one of the richest coastlines in Europe. Norway alone is carved by thousands of kilometers of rugged shoreline, broken into deep fjords where saltwater and freshwater meet. These sheltered waters became ideal habitats for countless species of fish. Every village located near the sea possessed an extraordinary natural pantry, one that renewed itself year after year. Long before sunrise, fishermen would already be preparing their boats. Small wooden vessels slid quietly into the calm waters while mist still floated above the fjords. Nets were carefully folded, hooks inspected, and simple lines wrapped neatly around wooden reels. There were no engines, no electronic fish vendors, and no weather forecasts. Success depended entirely upon experience, observation, and generations of knowledge passed from father to son. The sea rewarded those who understood it. Among the most valuable catches was cod. Cod became one of the greatest gifts the northern Atlantic could offer. Growing to impressive sizes and swimming in enormous numbers, it provided firm white meat that was both nutritious and remarkably easy to preserve. Unlike fattier fish, cod could be dried naturally in the cold, windy Scandinavian climate without spoiling quickly. For Viking communities, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Fresh food was always temporary. Dried food could mean survival. Throughout coastal settlements, rows of wooden drying racks stood exposed to the steady ocean breeze. Freshly caught cod were cleaned, split open, and hung carefully for weeks. The cold air slowly removed moisture while preventing rapid decay. What remained was stockfish, a product so hard it resembled carved wood more than fresh food. But appearances were deceptive. Properly stored, dried cod could remain edible for months, sometimes even years. Before eating, pieces were soaked or gently cooked in soups and stews until they softened again. This simple preservation method allowed families to store enormous quantities of protein without using expensive salt. Even today, dried cod remains one of Norway's most famous traditional foods, a living reminder of techniques perfected more than 1,000 years ago. If cod was the king of preserved fish, herring was the fish of abundance. Every year, immense schools of herring migrated through northern waters in astonishing numbers. During successful seasons, fishermen could fill their boats in remarkably little time. Entire communities hurried to process the catch before it spoiled. Herring possessed another important advantage. Its rich oils made it highly nutritious, providing valuable fats during long northern winters when calories became especially precious. Families salted herring inside wooden barrels or smoked it slowly over hardwood fires, creating food that remained edible long after fresh fish had disappeared from local waters. For ordinary Vikings, a meal of dark bread and smoked herring would have been far more common than roasted beef or wild game. It was simple, it was affordable, and most importantly, it was reliable. Then there was salmon. Unlike cod and herring, salmon followed remarkable seasonal migrations between rivers and the sea. During spawning season, Viking fishermen waited patiently beside rushing rivers, knowing that thousands of fish would soon return upstream. The arrival of salmon was eagerly anticipated. Its rich, flavorful flesh offered welcome variety after months of eating preserved foods. Fresh salmon might be roasted over open flames, gently boiled, or preserved by smoking for later use. Although not every settlement had equal access to salmon rivers, those that did considered them among their greatest natural resources. The Vikings understood that fresh fish was a luxury measured not in wealth, but in time. Once caught, fish began to spoil quickly. That is why preservation became almost as important as fishing itself. Smoking was perhaps the second great preservation technique after drying. Inside specialized smokehouses or beneath carefully controlled fires, fish hung from wooden beams while cool smoke drifted upward for days. Rather than cooking the fish completely, the smoke slowly removed moisture while coating the flesh with natural compounds that discouraged bacteria and insects. The result was food that could travel aboard ships, survive long winters, and feed families far from the coast. For sailors preparing to cross the North Sea or even the Atlantic, smoked and dried fish became indispensable companions. They occupied little space, required no refrigeration, and provided concentrated nutrition during voyages lasting weeks. Fishing itself never truly stopped. Unlike farming, which followed the rhythm of spring planting and autumn harvest, fishing remained a year-round occupation. Every season brought different opportunities. Spring welcomed returning migratory fish. Summer offered calmer seas and abundant catches. Autumn became the crucial period for preserving enough food before winter. Even during the coldest months, determined fishermen ventured onto icy waters whenever conditions allowed. Although storms, freezing temperatures, and rough seas made every journey dangerous, the ocean could never be ignored. A successful winter catch might mean the difference between comfort and hunger. Fishing demanded courage every bit as real as sailing into battle. Small boats faced towering waves, sudden squalls, hidden rocks, and freezing water capable of killing within minutes. Every trip carried risk, yet countless Viking families accepted that danger because the sea consistently rewarded skill and persistence. It is no coincidence that the Vikings became some of history's greatest sailors. Their relationship with the ocean began long before famous raids on distant kingdoms. It began with ordinary fishermen learning to read tides, winds, currents, and changing skies in search of tomorrow's meal. Every voyage, no matter how small, strengthened the maritime knowledge that would eventually carry Viking ships across Europe, into the Mediterranean, and even to North America. In many ways, fishing taught the Vikings everything they needed to know about the sea. It taught patience, it taught resilience, it taught respect for nature's power. Most of all, it taught them that survival depended not on taking from the ocean whenever they pleased, but on understanding its rhythms and preparing wisely for the seasons when its generosity might disappear. So while legends celebrate Viking warriors with swords in their hands, history quietly reminds us of another figure standing beside them, the fisherman hauling heavy nets from icy waters at dawn. Without him, there would have been no thriving villages, no great voyages, and perhaps no Viking Age at all. If Hollywood has taught us anything about Viking food, it is this. Every meal seems to include an enormous roasted animal turning slowly over an open fire. Warriors laugh around long tables, carving thick slices of pork or beef while raising drinking horns in celebration. Meat appears endless, abundant, and available whenever someone is hungry. The truth was very different. For most Viking families, meat was one of the most valuable foods they possessed. It was certainly enjoyed, but it was not an everyday luxury. In fact, the animals roaming around a Viking farm were often worth far more alive than dead. To understand why, we must step outside the longhouse and into the farmyard. A Viking family's wealth was measured not only by silver or land but also by livestock. Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs represented security. They supplied food, clothing, tools, and trade goods throughout the year. Killing an animal meant giving up all of those future benefits in exchange for one large meal. That was a decision no sensible farmer made lightly. Cattle were perhaps the most valuable animals of all. Although beef was highly prized, cows were usually kept alive for as long as possible. A healthy cow produced milk almost every day during the warmer months. That milk became butter, cheese, curds, and other dairy products that could feed an entire household. Oxen also helped pull plows through the rocky Scandinavian soil, making agriculture far more productive. Only when an animal became too old to produce milk, too weak to work, or when winter fodder became scarce would it often be slaughtered. As a result, fresh beef appeared only occasionally on the family table. When it did, nothing went to waste. The meat was carefully divided, the fat saved for cooking, the bones boiled repeatedly to make rich broths, the hide transformed into leather, and the horns carved into cups, combs, or tools. Even tendons become strong cords for sewing or fastening equipment. Every part had value. Sheep played an equally important role. Today many people associate sheep primarily with lamb, but for the Vikings, wool was often even more valuable than meat. Scandinavian winters demanded warm clothing, blankets, sails, and woven fabrics, all of which depended upon healthy flocks. Every spring, sheep were sheared, providing the raw material that women transformed into thread and cloth through countless hours of spinning and weaving. Those textiles clothed families, supplied trade, and even helped build the sails that carried Viking ships across distant seas. Naturally, A sheep capable of producing wool year after year represented a far better investment than a single meal. Still, mutton occasionally appeared on the menu, particularly during seasonal slaughter in late autumn. Goats served a similar purpose. Unlike cattle, goats thrived on steep hillsides and rocky terrain where little else could graze. They supplied milk, cheese, hides, and occasionally meat. Their remarkable ability to survive in difficult landscapes made them invaluable companions for many Viking households. Goat meat was lean, flavorful, and practical, but like most livestock, goats were usually slaughtered only when necessary. Then there were pigs. Among all domesticated animals, pigs were perhaps the closest thing the Vikings had to an efficient source of meat. Unlike cows, pigs produced no milk. Unlike sheep, they provided no wool. Their greatest purpose was simple: they converted forest food into meat. Throughout summer and autumn, pigs wandered freely through woodlands, feeding on acorns, roots, mushrooms, berries, and fallen nuts. Because they gathered much of their own food, they required less stored winter fodder than cattle. This made them ideal candidates for autumn slaughter. As winter approached, many Viking families chose to butcher pigs before the cold months arrived. Keeping large numbers of animals alive through winter demanded enormous quantities of hay and stored feed. By reducing the herd before snowfall, families conserved precious resources while filling smokehouses and storage rooms with preserved meat. Pork therefore became one of the more common meats available during winter, though even then it was eaten carefully rather than extravagantly. Large joints might be salted or smoked. Sausages were prepared whenever possible. Fat was rendered into cooking grease. Even blood could be used in nourishing dishes rather than discarded. Again, almost nothing was wasted. One type of meat often surprises modern audiences: horse meat. Today, horses are widely viewed as companions or working animals. But in the Viking Age, horse meat was sometimes consumed, particularly during important religious ceremonies before the arrival of Christianity. During certain pagan rituals, horses could be sacrificed to the Norse gods. The meat was then shared among participants in a communal feast that carried deep spiritual significance. Eating together symbolized unity between families, communities, and the divine powers they believed governed harvests, weather, and fortune. As Christianity gradually spread across Scandinavia, these traditions declined. Church authorities discouraged horse meat because of its close association with older pagan beliefs, and over time it largely disappeared from everyday diets in many regions. Yet livestock was not the only source of meat. The forests surrounding Viking settlements teemed with wild animals. Hunters pursued red deer, elk, roe deer, wild boar, hares, and occasionally bears, depending on local conditions. Birds such as ducks, geese, and ptarmigan also supplemented the household diet, while skilled archers trapped smaller animals for their fur as well as their meat. Hunting, however, was unpredictable. Unlike farming or fishing, success could never be guaranteed. A hunter might spend several exhausting days tracking deer through forests, without returning home with anything at all. Harsh winters often made wildlife scarce, while dangerous animals presented serious risks. For that reason, wild game added welcome variety, but rarely became the primary source of food for most families. The greatest abundance of meat usually arrived during one particular season: autumn. As daylight shortened and cold weather approached, Viking communities entered one of the busiest periods of the entire year. Families harvested grain, gathered berries, collected firewood, preserved fish, and made the difficult decision about which animals could realistically survive the coming winter. Those selected for slaughter provided fresh meat for a brief time before preservation began. Smokehouses filled with fragrant wood smoke, barrels were packed with salted cuts. Large pots simmered with rich stews. The entire community worked together, because everyone understood the importance of these weeks. Winter would soon lock the landscape beneath snow and ice, and there would be few opportunities to replace whatever food had not been stored. Meat also played a central role during celebrations. Seasonal festivals, weddings, successful harvest feasts, and religious gatherings often featured roasted pork, beef, mutton, or game. These occasions brought families and neighbors together around long tables where food became a symbol of gratitude, generosity, and shared survival. Such feasts were memorable precisely because they were uncommon. Most ordinary evenings ended with bread, porridge, dairy, fish, or vegetable soup, not towering platters of roasted meat. Perhaps that is what makes Viking food so fascinating. Its true story is not one of endless abundance, but of careful choices. Every animal represented months or years of patient care. Every piece of meat reflected difficult decisions about the future. The Vikings understood something that many modern societies rarely need to consider. Today's feast might become tomorrow's shortage if resources were used carelessly. Their meals remind us that survival was never built upon excess. It was built upon restraint, planning, and deep respect for every living creature that helped sustain the household. So while legends celebrate grand banquets filled with roasted meat and overflowing drinking horns, the everyday reality was quieter and, in many ways, far more remarkable. The Vikings did not become one of history's most resilient civilizations because they feasted every day. They became resilient because they knew exactly when not to. As the morning sun climbs higher above the mountains, the Viking farm begins to fill with familiar sounds. Sheep wander across the hillside, goats climb effortlessly over rocky slopes, and cows graze quietly in patches of green pasture. To a visitor, these animals might simply appear to be another part of the landscape. To a Viking family, however, they represented something far more important. They were living food stores. Unlike meat, which disappeared once an animal was slaughtered, dairy animals continued to provide nourishment day after day, month after month. A healthy cow, goat, or sheep could feed an entire household without sacrificing its own life, making milk one of the most valuable resources in the Viking world. In many ways, dairy was the quiet hero of the Norse diet. It rarely appears in dramatic stories about Viking warriors or famous voyages, yet it was present almost every single day. Long before modern nutrition identified proteins, calcium, or healthy fats, Viking families already understood through experience that dairy kept people strong, especially during long winters when fresh foods became scarce. The day often began with milking. Before breakfast was fully prepared, family members walked to the byre where cattle and goats had spent the night. Using simple wooden buckets, they carefully milked each animal by hand. It was patient, repetitive work that required skill and gentleness. A frightened or uncomfortable animal could produce far less milk, so experienced farmers treated their livestock with surprising care. The amount of milk available depended entirely on the seasons. During spring and summer, when fresh grass covered the fields, cows and goats produced abundant milk. The long daylight hours allowed animals to graze for much of the day, increasing both the quantity and quality of their milk. Winter told a different story. Snow buried the pastures, and livestock survived on hay harvested during the previous summer. Milk production declined dramatically, reminding every family that they needed to make the most of the warmer months. Fresh milk was certainly enjoyed, especially by children, but it came with a significant problem. It spoiled quickly. Without refrigeration, milk could sour within a short time, particularly during warmer weather. Rather than viewing this as a disaster, the Vikings saw it as an opportunity. Almost immediately after milking, much of the fresh milk was transformed into products that lasted far longer. One of the most important was soft cheese. Cheese making allowed Viking households to preserve valuable nutrients, while greatly extending the life of their dairy, Fresh milk was gently heated before natural cultures or acidic ingredients encouraged it to separate into curds and whey. The curds became cheese. The whey was rarely wasted. It could be consumed as a drink, fed to livestock, or used in other foods, ensuring that nearly every part of the milk served a purpose. Most Viking cheeses were relatively soft compared to many modern varieties. They were mild, fresh, and versatile, eaten with dark bread, added to porridge, or carried during long journeys. Some cheeses were lightly salted to improve preservation, while others were allowed to dry gradually into firmer forms suitable for storage. Cheese represented concentrated nutrition. A relatively small piece contained protein, fat, minerals, and energy, exactly what hard-working farmers, fishermen, and sailors needed to sustain long days of physical labor. Butter was equally valuable. Producing butter required patience. Milk or cream was poured into wooden churns and agitated repeatedly until tiny droplets of fat gradually combined into solid golden butter. The process demanded considerable effort, often taking a long time before success finally arrived, but the reward was worth every minute. Butter was one of the richest sources of calories available to Viking families. During freezing winters, those extra calories helped maintain body heat while providing lasting energy. Spread across coarse barley bread, melted into porridge, or stirred into stews, butter transformed simple meals into far more satisfying ones. Yet butter offered another remarkable advantage. When salted properly, it could be stored for extended periods. Some households buried tightly sealed containers of butter in cool ground, or kept them in specially prepared storage areas where low temperatures slowed spoilage. Archaeologists have even discovered ancient preserved butter hidden in northern peat bogs, demonstrating just how seriously people valued this precious food. No matter how carefully meat or fish had been preserved, butter often remained one of the most treasured supplies inside the longhouse. Perhaps the most fascinating dairy product associated with the Viking world is skyr. Although many people today think of it as yogurt, skyr is actually much closer to a fresh cultured dairy cheese. It has been produced in Iceland for more than 1,000 years and traces its origins directly back to Norse settlers, who carried their food traditions across the North Atlantic. Making skyr required both skill and patience. Fresh milk was gently warmed before carefully introducing bacterial cultures and natural enzymes. Over time, the milk thickened into a rich, creamy substance that was strained to remove excess liquid. The result was extraordinary. Skyr was thick, smooth, slightly tangy, and packed with protein. It could be eaten fresh, mixed with berries gathered during summer, flavored with precious honey, or enjoyed alongside bread as part of an ordinary meal. For Viking families, skyr combined excellent nutrition with practical preservation, making it one of the smartest users of fresh milk. Even today, modern nutritionists praise skyr for its impressive protein content and relatively low fat, proving that this ancient food continues to meet modern dietary ideals. The nutritional value of dairy cannot be overstated. Life in Scandinavia demanded enormous physical effort. Farmers plowed rocky fields by hand. Fishermen rowed for hours across cold seas. Blacksmiths worked beside blazing forges. Women carried water, spun wool, wove cloth, baked bread, raised children, tended livestock, and preserved food for winter. Such labor required a dependable source of energy. Milk supplied protein for muscle repair, calcium for strong bones and teeth, healthy fats for warmth and endurance, and essential vitamins that became particularly important during long winters when fresh vegetables and fruit were limited. Without understanding the science, Viking families instinctively recognized that dairy helped people remain healthy. Children grew stronger. Adults recovered more quickly from exhausting work. Older family members benefited from food that was nourishing yet relatively easy to eat. Dairy also created security. A family with healthy cows or goats possessed a renewable source of food that continued producing day after day. Even if fishing became difficult or a harvest disappointed, milk could still become butter, cheese, or skyr. It represented resilience. Perhaps this explains why livestock occupied such an important place in Viking society. Cattle were not merely valuable because they could eventually provide beef. They were valuable because every sunrise offered another opportunity to produce milk, and with it came countless possibilities for feeding the household. In many respects, dairy embodied the Viking approach to survival. Rather than consuming everything immediately, they transformed fragile resources into foods that lasted longer, nourished more people, and carried them safely through uncertain seasons. So while legends often celebrate Viking swords, ships, and spectacular battles, another quiet story unfolded every morning inside thousands of Scandinavian farms. It was the story of wooden buckets filled with fresh milk, patient hands churning butter, cheese hanging to mature, and bowls of thick skyr waiting beside dark barley bread. These humble foods rarely appeared in heroic sagas. Yet they strengthened the men who crossed stormy seas, the women who managed thriving households, and the children who would inherit the Viking world. Without milk, butter, cheese, and skyr, the Viking age might have looked very different indeed. Sometimes, the greatest source of strength was not found on the battlefield. It was waiting quietly inside the dairy room of a simple longhouse. When people think about Viking food, vegetables are rarely the first thing that comes to mind. Most imagine tables filled with smoked fish, roasted meat, dark bread, and overflowing drinking horns. Yet hidden behind every Viking longhouse was something far less dramatic but no less essential: a small vegetable garden. It was modest in size, carefully tended, and often overlooked by later storytellers. But these simple plots of earth quietly provided many of the foods that kept Viking families healthy throughout the changing seasons. Unlike grain fields that stretched across open farmland, vegetable gardens were usually located close to the longhouse. This made them easy to protect from wandering animals and convenient for daily care. Women, children, and elderly family members often worked these gardens, watering young plants, removing weeds, and harvesting vegetables as they matured. Every handful of fresh produce mattered. In a land where winters lasted for months and fresh food became increasingly scarce, every successful harvest represented security for the family. Perhaps the most important vegetable growing in these gardens was cabbage. Although modern supermarkets offer dozens of different varieties, Viking cabbage was much simpler. It was hardy, reliable, and remarkably well suited to the cool Scandinavian climate. Better still, cabbage stored exceptionally well. Once harvested, whole heads could be kept in cool storage areas for weeks or even months. Leaves were chopped into soups and stews, boiled alongside meat or fish, or eaten with bread as part of an ordinary meal. For Viking families, cabbage was one of the few vegetables that remained available long after autumn had ended. It became an important source of vitamins during the dark months, when little else remained fresh. Standing beside the cabbage beds were rows of onions. To us, onions are simply another cooking ingredient. To the Vikings, they were almost indispensable. Their strong flavor transformed simple dishes into satisfying meals. A pot of barley porridge tasted richer with chopped onions. Fish stew became more aromatic. Even coarse bread accompanied by butter seemed more enjoyable with fresh onion on the side. Unlike delicate vegetables that spoiled quickly, onions could also be stored for long periods in cool, dry places. This durability made them ideal for northern households preparing for winter. Closely related to onions was another familiar plant: leeks. Leeks thrived in the Scandinavian climate and appeared frequently in Viking cooking. Their flavor was milder than onions, but equally valuable. A handful of sliced leeks added depths to stews and boiled vegetables, without requiring expensive spices imported from distant lands. Because exotic seasonings such as pepper, cinnamon, or cloves were rare and costly, ordinary Viking cooks relied on local ingredients to create flavor. Leeks became one of nature's simplest yet most effective seasonings. Another garden favorite was the humble turnip. Today, turnips rarely receive much attention, but during the Viking Age, they were among the most dependable vegetables available. Turnips grew relatively quickly, tolerated cool weather, and stored remarkably well through the winter. Their roots could be roasted beside the fire, boiled until tender, mashed into thick soups, or sliced into hearty stews. Even the leafy tops found a purpose. Rather than discarding them, Viking families cooked the greens much like cabbage or other leafy vegetables, ensuring that almost nothing was wasted. Resourcefulness shaped every meal. Carrots also appeared in Viking gardens, although they looked quite different from the bright orange vegetables we know today. Ancient carrots were usually purple, white, or pale yellow. They were smaller, thinner, and often less sweet than modern varieties developed centuries later through selective breeding. Nevertheless, they provided valuable nutrition. Whether boiled with meat, added to soups, or eaten alongside other vegetables, carrots contributed both flavor and variety to meals that might otherwise become repetitive during long winters. The Vikings did not grow vegetables simply for taste. They grew them because diversity increased their chances of survival. Another essential crop was peas. Peas offered something extremely valuable that many vegetables could not: protein. Fresh peas were enjoyed during summer whenever available, but much of the harvest was carefully dried before storage. Once dried, peas remained edible for months. Throughout winter they became one of the most common ingredients in thick soups and stews. When cooked slowly over the hearth, dried peas softened into creamy, filling meals that paired perfectly with barley bread or smoked fish. A single pot of pea soup could feed an entire family after a long day's work. Equally important were fava beans. Sometimes called broad beans, they were among the oldest cultivated crops in northern Europe and flourished surprisingly well in Viking agriculture. Like peas, fava beans contained large amounts of plant protein. For families that could not afford frequent meat, beans became an essential alternative. Fresh beans were eaten during harvest season, while mature beans were dried and stored for winter. When combined with grains such as barley or oats, they created balanced, nourishing meals capable of sustaining hard physical labor. Modern nutrition tells us that grains and legumes complement one another by providing a more complete range of amino acids. The Vikings knew nothing about proteins or amino acids. Yet, through generations of experience, they discovered combinations that kept people healthy. Knowledge often comes long before science explains why it works. The vegetables themselves change with the rhythm of the seasons. Spring brought fresh greens after months of preserved food. Summer offered abundance, filling gardens with vibrant life. Autumn became a race against time. Families harvested every usable crop before frost destroyed it. Cellars were filled. Wooden barrels were packed. Bundles of onions and leeks hung from ceiling beams to dry. Turnips were buried beneath layers of straw. Peas and beans were spread out carefully before being stored in sacks or wooden chests. Every vegetable harvested represented another week of food during the coming winter. The Viking garden was not a place of luxury. It was a carefully managed insurance policy against hunger. Looking around one of these gardens today, we might notice how ordinary everything seems. No tomatoes, no potatoes, no corn, no peppers. Those familiar foods had not yet reached northern Europe. Instead, Viking agriculture relied entirely upon crops that had adapted over centuries to Scandinavia's demanding climate. They grew what survived, not what looked impressive. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson these gardens have to teach us. The Viking Age was never built upon endless abundance. It was built upon careful planning, practical knowledge, and respect for the natural world. Every cabbage leaf, every onion bulb, every turnip, carrot, and fava bean represented countless hours of work beneath the northern sky. Together, these humble vegetables formed the quiet foundation of everyday life. They nourished children growing through long winters. They strengthened farmers preparing fields for another season. They sustained fishermen before dawn voyages onto icy seas. And alongside bread, fish, and dairy, they completed a diet that was far more balanced and far more sophisticated than the legends of endless feasting would ever lead us to believe. Beyond the cultivated fields, beyond the vegetable gardens, and beyond the grazing pastures, another pantry stretched across the Viking landscape. It had no fences, no carefully planted rows, no farmer to tend it. Instead, it was shaped entirely by nature. The forests of Scandinavia were far more than places of towering pine trees and hidden wildlife. To the Vikings, they were living storehouses, filled with foods that could supplement the family diet throughout the year. Whenever crops failed, fishing was poor, or winter stores began to run low, the forest often provided the difference between scarcity and survival. Unlike farming, gathering wild foods required patience rather than plows. Families learned to read the landscape just as carefully as fishermen read the sea. They knew which hillsides produced the sweetest berries, which clearings hid edible mushrooms, where hazel trees dropped their nuts each autumn, and which herbs could flavor a simple meal or soothe an illness. This knowledge was rarely written down. Instead, it passed quietly from one generation to the next. Children accompany their parents into the woods from an early age, learning which plants were safe to eat and which should never be touched. A mistake could have serious consequences, so experience became one of the family's greatest treasures. Perhaps the most eagerly anticipated gifts of the forest were wild berries. As summer warmed the Scandinavian countryside, bushes slowly filled with colorful fruit. Bilberries, lingonberries, wild strawberries, raspberries, crowberries and cloudberries appeared at different times throughout the season, offering brief moments of abundance before autumn arrived. These berries did far more than satisfy a craving for sweetness. They provided valuable vitamins after months of eating preserved foods. Fresh berries brightened otherwise simple meals, adding color and flavor to bowls of porridge, soft cheese or thick skyr. Sometimes they were eaten immediately while gathering, their juices staining fingers and lips. At other times they were carefully carried home in woven baskets to be preserved for the colder months ahead. Some berries were dried in the summer sun. Others were stored in cool containers where their natural acidity helped them last surprisingly well without added sugar. Every handful represented another small victory against the long Scandinavian winter. The forests also offered another remarkable resource: mushrooms. To modern foragers, mushroom hunting can seem like a relaxing weekend activity. For the Vikings, it was another valuable way to supplement the household's food supply. Edible mushrooms appeared after warm rains, pushing through moss-covered forest floors and fallen leaves. Families who understood the woodland well could collect generous baskets filled with nutritious fungi that added rich, earthy flavors to soups and stews. Yet mushroom gathering demanded caution. Not every mushroom was safe. Some were delicious. Others could be deadly. Generations of careful observation taught Viking families how to recognize the difference. This knowledge, preserved through experience rather than books, became just as valuable as any farming skill. As summer slowly gave way to autumn, another harvest began: hazelnuts. Hazel trees grew naturally across many parts of Scandinavia, producing clusters of nuts that ripened as the weather cooled. Gathering them became an important seasonal activity for entire families. Unlike soft fruits, hazelnuts possessed one enormous advantage: they stored exceptionally well. Properly dried and protected from moisture, they remained edible for many months. Rich in healthy fats, protein and calories, hazelnuts became ideal winter food. They could be eaten whole, crushed into porridge, mixed with bread dough, or added to simple desserts sweetened with precious honey. For travelers, hazelnuts also made an excellent portable snack. Small, lightweight, and highly nutritious, they provided lasting energy during long journeys across forests or aboard ships. Scattered among the woodlands were another familiar sight: wild apple trees. These ancient apples looked quite different from the large, sweet fruits found in modern supermarkets. They were generally much smaller, firmer, and noticeably more tart. Few people would mistake them for dessert. Yet to Viking families, wild apples were another welcome source of nourishment. Fresh apples were eaten during autumn whenever possible. Others were sliced and dried beside the fire, extending their usefulness well into winter. Their sharp flavor balanced richer foods such as cheese or pork, while cooked apples softened into comforting additions to stews or simple fruit dishes. Not everything gathered from the forest was meant to satisfy hunger. Many wild herbs played equally important roles. Although the Vikings lacked imported spices available to wealthy merchants farther south, nature supplied its own collection of flavors. Wild thyme, angelica, yarrow, juniper, sorrel, and other native herbs found their way into cooking, preserving, and traditional medicine. A handful of herbs could completely transform an ordinary pot of cabbage soup or fish stew. Some leaves were brewed into simple herbal drinks. Others eased stomach discomfort, treated minor wounds, or helped preserve certain foods. To the Vikings, the line between food and medicine was often remarkably thin. Plants nourished the body in more ways than one. Perhaps the sweetest treasure hidden within the forests came not from trees or bushes, but from bees. Honey. Long before refined sugar reached northern Europe, honey was the greatest natural sweetener available to the Viking world. Finding wild bee nests required both patience and courage. Bees often built their colonies inside hollow tree trunks high above the forest floor. Harvesting honey meant climbing trees, carefully opening the nest, and enduring the angry insects protecting their precious stores. The reward justified the effort. Honey was incredibly valuable. It sweetened porridge, flavored cheese, preserved fruit, and enhanced festive dishes prepared for special occasions. Unlike berries or mushrooms, honey could be stored for astonishing lengths of time without spoiling, making it one of nature's most remarkable foods. It also served another famous purpose. When mixed with water and fermented, honey became mead, the legendary drink so often associated with Viking celebrations. Yet despite its reputation, honey itself was too precious to waste casually. Most families used it sparingly, reserving larger quantities for important festivals, weddings, or religious ceremonies. Looking back across the Viking landscape, it becomes clear that survival depended upon far more than fields and livestock. The forest quietly completed the menu. Its berries supplied vital vitamins. Its mushrooms enriched humble meals. Its hazelnuts provided precious calories. Its wild apples added welcome variety. Its herbs flavored food and supported health. And its honey offered one of the rarest luxuries the natural world could provide. To modern eyes, these may seem like small additions to the Viking diet, but together they reveal something extraordinary about the Norse people. They did not simply live beside nature, they lived with it. They understood its rhythms, respected its limits, and accepted that every season brought different gifts. Rather than forcing the land to provide exactly what they wanted, they learned to appreciate what it freely offered. In the quiet forests of Scandinavia, every berry picked, every mushroom gathered, every hazelnut collected, and every drop of honey harvested reminded the Vikings of a simple truth. Sometimes, the greatest abundance is found not in cultivated fields, but in the wild places that patiently reward those who know where and when to look. As autumn settled over Scandinavia, the rhythm of Viking life began to change. The long days of planting, fishing, and gathering were coming to an end. The air grew colder with each passing week. Leaves turned shades of gold and crimson, and the first frosts crept silently across the fields before dawn. For a Viking family, this was not simply another beautiful season. It was a race against time. Everyone understood that winter was approaching, and with it would come months of frozen ground, violent storms, and a landscape that offered very little fresh food. The question was no longer, what shall we eat today? It became, how will we eat 4 months from now? The answer lay in one of the greatest skills the Vikings ever mastered: food preservation. In the Viking world, preserving food was not a convenience. It was survival. Every fish caught, every animal slaughtered, every vegetable harvested, and every berry gathered had to last far beyond the season in which it was collected. A careless family might enjoy a few weeks of abundance, only to face hunger before winter ended. A careful family, however, could remain well fed until spring returned. Perhaps the oldest and most widespread method was smoking. Throughout Viking villages, small smokehouses stood beside longhouses or barns. Inside these simple wooden buildings, fires burned slowly for days using carefully selected woods, such as alder, birch, or oak. The goal was not to cook the food. The goal was to preserve it. Strips of pork, mutton, goat meat, salmon, and other fish were suspended from wooden beams high above the fire. Thick clouds of cool smoke drifted upward, gradually drying the surface while coating the food with natural compounds that slowed spoilage. The process demanded patience. Too much heat would cook the meat, too little smoke would leave it vulnerable to decay. Experienced families understood exactly how to maintain the fire, sometimes tending it continuously for several days. When finished, the smoked meat possessed a rich, deep flavor unlike anything found in fresh food. More importantly, it could survive for weeks or even months. Fish benefited, especially from smoking. Freshly caught salmon or herring could spoil within a matter of days, but once properly smoked, they became dependable provisions for long journeys, winter meals, or trading with neighboring settlements. Another equally important technique relied not on smoke, but on airing. The cold, windy climate of Scandinavia proved surprisingly effective at preserving certain foods. Cod became the perfect example. After cleaning the fish, Vikings hung them from tall wooden racks overlooking the coast. Their powerful sea winds and cool northern temperatures slowly removed moisture without causing rapid decay. Over several weeks, the fish transformed into stockfish. It became incredibly hard, so hard that it sometimes resembled carved wood rather than food. Yet appearances were deceiving. When soaked or slowly cooked in soups, dried fish returned to life, providing nourishing meals months after being caught. Drying extended beyond fish. Herbs were tied into bundles and suspended from ceiling beams. Apples were sliced and laid out to lose their moisture. Berries were spread carefully on woven mats whenever weather permitted. Even mushrooms gathered from the forest could be dried and stored for winter cooking. Every successful drying rack represented another week of food security. Salt offered another powerful solution. Today, salt is inexpensive and found in nearly every kitchen. For the Vikings, however, it was a valuable commodity. Some coastal communities produced salt by evaporating seawater, while inland settlements often acquired it through trade. Because obtaining salt required significant effort, families used it carefully and efficiently. When rubbed into fresh meat or packed around fish, salt drew out moisture that bacteria needed to survive. This dramatically slowed spoilage, while allowing food to remain edible for extended periods. Large wooden barrels filled with salted herring became common sights in many Viking communities, particularly those involved in fishing and trade. Salted pork and beef also provided valuable winter provisions. Although heavily salted food often required soaking before cooking, the inconvenience was a small price to pay for dependable nourishment months later. Yet perhaps the most fascinating preservation method required no fire and no drying at all: fermentation. Long before scientists discovered beneficial bacteria, Viking families had learned that certain foods naturally transformed into products that lasted longer. Milk became cheese, cream became cultured butter, fresh milk developed into thick skyr. Vegetables could also be fermented, producing foods that remained edible long after harvest. Even fish was occasionally preserved through carefully controlled fermentation in some northern regions. To modern tastes, fermented foods can seem unusual. To the Vikings, they represented remarkable ingenuity. Rather than fighting nature, they worked alongside it, allowing beneficial microorganisms to protect food from harmful ones. Fermentation not only extended shelf life, but often improved flavor and digestibility as well. Once food had been preserved, it still needed a safe place to wait for winter. This brought us to another important feature of Viking farms: the storage cellar. Many households dug cool underground pits or built partially buried storage rooms where temperatures remained low throughout much of the year. These natural cellars became the household's pantry. Barrels filled with salted fish lined one wall. Bundles of onions and garlic hung from ceiling beams. Turnips, cabbage, carrots, and apples rested beneath layers of straw. Sacks of barley, oats, dried peas, and fava beans were carefully protected from moisture and hungry rodents. Every item had its place. Every family member understood the importance of keeping these stores cool and secure. Opening the cellar during winter must have brought a profound sense of reassurance. Each shelf represented months of planning. Each barrel represented another opportunity to survive. Perhaps this careful preparation explains why preservation occupied such a central place in Viking life. The Scandinavian winter was neither short nor forgiving. For weeks, heavy snow-covered fields where vegetables had once grown. Fishing became more dangerous as icy storms swept across the sea. Wild plants disappeared beneath frozen ground. Fresh fruit became little more than a memory. Without preserved food, entire communities would have faced starvation before spring returned. Every autumn, therefore, became a season of extraordinary cooperation. Neighbors helped one another slaughter livestock. Families worked together to smoke fish. Children gathered firewood. Women supervised drying herbs, making cheese, storing vegetables, and preparing countless jars, barrels, and baskets. The entire village shared one common goal: preparing for the months that no one could control. Looking back today, it is easy to admire Viking ships, remarkable weapons, and daring voyages across distant oceans. Yet none of those achievements would have been possible without something far less glamorous: a well-stocked pantry. The greatest Viking victories did not begin when longships left the harbor. They began months earlier, inside warm smokehouses, beside drying racks swaying in the northern wind, and within cool underground cellars filled with carefully preserved food. Because in the Viking world, survival was never won by strength alone. It was earned through patience, preparation, and the wisdom to understand that the harvest of today had to feed the family long after the fields had fallen silent beneath the snow. As evening settles over the Viking village, the sounds of the day's labor begin to fade. Fishing boats have returned to the shore, livestock have been led into their shelters, and the last bundles of firewood are stacked beside the entrance of the longhouse. Outside, the cold Scandinavian air grows sharper with every passing hour. Inside, however, another world comes alive. The heart of every Viking home is not a throne, a dining table, or a place of honor. It is the fire. Running along the center of the longhouse is a long, open hearth, its glowing embers casting warm orange light across wooden walls blackened by years of smoke. There is no chimney in the modern sense. Instead, smoke slowly rises toward a narrow opening in the roof before drifting into the evening sky. Some of it escapes immediately, while some lingers inside, filling the air with the familiar scent of burning birch and pine. To modern visitors, the room might seem smoky and uncomfortable. To a Viking family, it feels like home. The central fire is far more than a source of warmth. It is the kitchen, the light, the gathering place, and the beating heart of the household. Every important moment of daily life unfolds around it. Children play near its warmth, elders tell stories beside its glow, craftsmen repair tools in its light, and every meal begins with its steady flames. Keeping the fire alive is one of the household's most important responsibilities. Rather than allowing it to burn out each night, families often covered the glowing embers with ash before going to sleep. By morning, the fire could be revived with fresh wood, saving valuable time and effort. In damp Scandinavian weather, starting a completely new fire every day was difficult, especially during winter. A living fire meant security. Without it, there would be no hot meals, no warmth against the freezing nights, and no place where the family could comfortably gather together. Suspended above the glowing flames hangs one of the Viking kitchen's most valuable possessions, an iron cooking pot. Iron was expensive and required considerable skill to produce, making large pots treasured household items. Wealthier families might own several, while poorer households often relied on a single well-cared-for pot that served nearly every cooking need. This humble vessel rarely sat empty. Morning began with oat or barley porridge gently simmering inside it. Later in the day, vegetables, beans, fish, or meat might be added to create nourishing stews. Sometimes the same pot remained over the fire for hours, with fresh ingredients continually added as they became available. In many ways, the Viking stew was never truly finished. A handful of cabbage harvested from the garden, a few sliced onions, pieces of smoked fish, dried peas softened by slow cooking, perhaps a little butter stirred in at the end. Every ingredient found its way into the pot, creating meals that were both economical and deeply satisfying. Slow cooking also made practical sense. Tough cuts of meat became tender after hours above gentle heat, while dried foods such as beans or stockfish gradually softened into rich, flavorful dishes. The fire worked patiently, transforming simple ingredients into nourishing meals without wasting precious fuel. Not every meal, however, came from the pot. Roasting was equally important. Across the open hearth, sturdy iron or wooden spits held larger cuts of meat above glowing embers. Pork, moat, wild game, or freshly caught fish could be slowly turned by hand, allowing heat to cook the food evenly while preserving its natural juices. The process demanded constant attention. Place the meat too close to the flames, and it would burn before cooking through. Hold it too high, and dinner might take hours. Experienced cooks judged temperature not with thermometers but with years of practice. They understood the color of glowing coals, the movement of flames, and even the sound of sizzling fat. Cooking was as much instinct as technique. For smaller foods, another simple tool proved invaluable: the baking stone. Large, flat stones were heated directly within the fire until they absorbed intense warmth. Once hot, they became natural cooking surfaces. Flat rounds of barley bread were laid across the stone, slowly developing crisp crusts while remaining soft inside. Fish fillets, onions, mushrooms, or sliced vegetables could also be cooked this way, requiring little more than heat and patience. Unlike modern ovens, baking stones used every bit of available energy from the fire. Nothing was wasted. The Viking kitchen contained surprisingly few tools by modern standards. There were no electric appliances, no polished steel countertops, and no shelves filled with specialized equipment. Instead, most utensils were carved from wood. Wooden bowls held soups and porridge. Wooden spoons stirred simmering stews. Wooden ladles lifted food from heavy iron pots. Drinking cups, plates, cutting boards, and storage containers were often crafted from timber gathered in nearby forests. Wood was abundant, easy to shape, and practical for everyday use. Skilled craftsmen transformed ordinary pieces of oak, ash, birch, or maple into beautiful household objects that combined usefulness with quiet artistry. Many were decorated with simple carved patterns, reminding us that even practical objects could possess beauty. Alongside wooden utensils were knives. Every adult owned one. Unlike today's kitchen knives reserved solely for cooking, a Viking knife served countless purposes throughout the day. It prepared food, carved wood, repaired equipment, cut rope, processed animal hides, and accompanied its owner almost everywhere. It was one of the most indispensable tools in Viking life. Cooking itself was rarely hurried. Without precise temperature controls or modern conveniences, preparing a meal required time. Bread baked slowly, stews simmered for hours, meat roasted patiently above glowing embers. Families learned to work around the rhythms of the fire, rather than forcing the fire to match their schedules. Perhaps this slower pace shaped something equally important: conversation. As food cooked, family members gathered around the hearth. Elders shared stories of distant voyages and remembered ancestors. Children listened while learning lessons that would never appear in written books. Plans for tomorrow's work were discussed. Repairs were made. Wool was spun. Nets were mended. The kitchen became much more than a place where meals were prepared. It became the center of family life. Looking back today, the Viking kitchen appears remarkably simple. A fire, an iron pot, a roasting spit, a heated stone, a handful of wooden tools. Yet from these humble resources came meals that nourished explorers who crossed the Atlantic, farmers who transformed rocky landscapes into productive fields, and communities that endured some of Europe's harshest climates. The longhouse kitchen reminds us that remarkable civilizations are not built only by kings, warriors, or great ships. They are also built around ordinary fires, where simple ingredients become shared meals become shared stories, and shared stories become traditions that endure for generations. In the glow of the Viking hearth, food was never just about survival. It was about family resilience, and the quiet comfort of coming home after another day beneath the vast northern sky. As the first light of morning filtered through the smoke hole of the longhouse, the youngest members of the household were already beginning another day of learning, helping, and growing. Before they learned to row a boat, tend sheep, weave cloth, or swing an axe, they learned something far more important. They learned to eat the same foods that had sustained generations before them. In the Viking Age, childhood looked very different from what we know today. There were no specially packaged children's meals, no sweet breakfast cereals, and no colorful snacks waiting between meals. Food was prepared for the entire household, and every member of the family shared what the farm, the forest, and the sea could provide. Even so, the youngest children followed a gradual journey toward the adult table. For infants, a mother's milk was the first and most important source of nourishment. Breastfeeding often continued for a long time compared with many modern societies, sometimes well into the child's second year. This not only provided essential nutrition, but also helped protect young children from illness during a time when clean water and food safety could never be taken for granted. As babies grew stronger, they slowly began tasting soft foods that were easy to digest. The first meals were usually simple. Warm porridge was often the food of choice. Made from oats or barley that had been cooked until soft, the porridge was easy for small children to eat and gentle on developing stomachs. Sometimes it was mixed with fresh milk or a little butter to make it richer. If the family had been fortunate enough to gather berries during the summer, a few mashed berries might occasionally be added, bringing a touch of sweetness to an otherwise plain meal. Porridge was more than comfort food. It was one of the safest and most dependable meals a growing child could receive. Rich in carbohydrates and surprisingly filling, it provided steady energy for children who spent their days exploring the farm, following their parents, and learning through observation. Milk continued to play an important role as children grew older. Fresh cow's milk or goat's milk supplied valuable protein, calcium, and healthy fats that supported growing bones and strong teeth. During seasons when fresh milk became scarce, dairy products such as soft cheese or thick cultured foods like sky helped fill the gap. Without understanding vitamins or minerals, Viking families knew from experience that children raised on good dairy products generally grew stronger and healthier. Bread soon became another daily companion. Just like the adults, children ate dense loaves from barley, rye, or oats. The bread was often softened by dipping it into warm soup, or spreading it with butter to make it easier for younger children to chew. Unlike modern bread, Viking loaves were coarse and hearty. Learning to eat them was simply another part of growing up. Fish also appeared early in a child's diet. Living beside the sea meant that fish was one of the most reliable foods available. Soft pieces of boiled or smoked cod, salmon, or herring could easily be added to soups or broken into small portions for children. Fish provided important nutrients that helped support healthy growth, though Viking families would never have described it that way. They simply understood that children needed nourishing food if they were to become capable adults. Vegetables completed many meals. Children ate much the same cabbage, onions, turnips, carrots, peas, and fava beans as everyone else in the household. Vegetables were usually cooked until tender before being added to soups or stews, making them easier to eat. Fresh berries gathered from nearby forests became welcome seasonal treats, while dried apples or preserved fruits occasionally brightened winter meals. Sweet foods remained rare, so children quickly learned to appreciate the natural flavors that each season offered. Mealtimes were also lessons. Children watched carefully as adults baked bread, stirred stews, churned butter, and preserved food for winter. Long before they could perform these tasks themselves, they absorbed the knowledge simply by being present. There was little separation between learning and living. A child helping gather peas in the garden was already learning how to feed a future family. One collecting berries in the forest was memorizing which plants could safely be eaten. One sitting beside the fire while bread baked on hot stones was discovering skills that would one day become everyday responsibilities. As children grew into adolescence, the distinction between children's food and adult food gradually disappeared. There was no special ceremony, no official birthday when everything changed. Instead, the transition happened naturally. As soon as a child could comfortably eat the family's ordinary meals, they did exactly that. The same bowls of porridge, slices of dark bread, fish, vegetables, stew, cheese, and preserved meats that nourished their parents also became their own daily diet. Growing older simply meant receiving larger portions and taking on greater responsibilities. By the age of 12 or 13, many Viking children were already contributing significantly to household life. Boys might accompany their fathers fishing, farming, or hunting, while girls often helped milk livestock, prepare meals, weave cloth, or care for younger siblings. Their food reflected these increasing demands, providing the energy needed for lives filled with constant physical work. Looking back, the Viking childhood diet appears remarkably balanced. Whole grains supplied energy, fish and dairy provided protein and healthy fats, vegetables and wild berries added valuable nutrients. Although meals were simple, they were built upon foods that had been refined through generations of practical experience rather than written recipes. The children who gathered around the hearth each evening were eating more than dinner. They were sharing in a tradition of resilience, resourcefulness, and cooperation that had sustained Viking families for centuries. One bowl of porridge, one piece of barley bread, and one warm meal at a time, they were quietly growing into the next generation of the Viking world. If you were invited into a Viking longhouse after a long day of farming or fishing, what would you expect to be handed first? Most people would probably imagine a large drinking horn overflowing with golden mead. It is one of the most enduring images of the Viking Age warriors laughing loudly around the fire, raising their cups in celebration before taking deep drinks of honey wine. The image is memorable, but like many Viking legends, it tells only part of the story. For the vast majority of people, on the vast majority of days, mead was not the drink waiting on the table. Everyday life required something far more practical. The beverages that accompanied ordinary meals were simple, nourishing, and closely connected to the rhythms of farm life. They reflected the same principles that shaped the Viking diet itself. Make the most of what nature provides, waste nothing, and prepare carefully for tomorrow. The most basic drink, of course, was water. Fresh water flowed from mountain streams, rivers, natural springs, and countless lakes scattered across Scandinavia. Many Viking settlements were deliberately built near reliable sources of clean water, making daily access relatively easy. Children fetched buckets each morning while adults carried wooden pails suspended from shoulder poles. Water was needed not only for drinking, but also for cooking porridge, preparing soup, washing tools, caring for livestock, and brewing ale. When drawn from clean springs or fast-moving streams, water was perfectly safe and formed an important part of daily life. However, not every source remained equally reliable. Stagnant pools could become contaminated by animals. Water stored for long periods sometimes developed unpleasant tastes. Busy settlements occasionally found that nearby water became less desirable as populations grew. For these reasons, Vikings often relied on more than water alone. Milk was another everyday favorite. Fresh cow's milk and goat's milk appeared frequently at the family table, especially during spring and summer when livestock grazed on rich pastures. For children, milk was one of the most important sources of nourishment. Adults enjoyed it as well, though much of the fresh milk was quickly transformed into butter, cheese, or skyr before it spoiled. Still, a cup of cool milk after hours of working in the fields or tending animals must have been both refreshing and satisfying. It contained valuable protein, healthy fats, and minerals that helped support lives filled with constant physical labor. Goat's milk was particularly valuable in mountainous regions where goats thrive better than cattle. Its rich flavor and reliable production made it an important part of many Viking households. Yet fresh milk had one weakness: it never lasted very long. Without refrigeration, it could sour quickly, especially during warmer months. Rather than throwing it away, Viking families transformed this natural process into another useful beverage: buttermilk. Today, many people associate buttermilk with baking recipes, but in the Viking Age it was a familiar everyday drink. Traditional buttermilk was the liquid left behind after butter had been churned from cream. Slightly tangy, refreshing, and surprisingly nutritious, it retained proteins, minerals, and beneficial bacteria that made it valuable in the daily diet. Because it kept somewhat longer than fresh milk, buttermilk became especially useful during warmer weather. A hard-working farmer returning from the fields might find a wooden cup filled with cool buttermilk waiting beside a piece of dark bark barley bread. Simple, refreshing, perfectly suited to the demands of everyday life. Perhaps the greatest surprise for many modern readers is the importance of ale. When we hear the word beer, we often imagine a strong alcoholic drink served in pubs or at celebrations. Viking ale was usually very different. Most households brewed what historians often call small ale or light ale. Its alcohol content was relatively low, often much weaker than many modern beers. Because brewing required boiling water during the process, The finished drink could sometimes be safer to consume than questionable water sources, particularly in larger settlements where water quality varied. Light ale also contained nutrients from grain and provided additional calories, making an excellent everyday beverage for people performing physically demanding work. Adults frequently drank it with meals. Older children sometimes consumed diluted versions. It was considered an ordinary part of household life, rather than an indulgence. Every family possessed its own brewing traditions. Barley formed the foundation of most ales, though oats or other grains might occasionally be included depending on local harvests. Brewing took time and experience, and successful batches became another source of quiet household pride. Like baking bread or preserving fish, brewing was simply another seasonal skill every capable family hoped to master. Then there was mead, the drink that captured the imagination of poets, storytellers, and later generations. Unlike ale, mead depended upon honey, and honey was precious. Collecting it from wild bee colonies or maintaining domesticated hives where possible required significant effort. Every drop represented countless flowers visited by thousands of bees throughout the summer. Naturally, no sensible Viking wasted such a valuable resource on ordinary daily drinking. Instead, honey was reserved for special purposes. Some sweetened food, some preserved fruit, and some became mead. When mixed with water and allowed to ferment, honey produced a rich golden drink unlike anything else available in Scandinavia. Mead carried an air of celebration. It appeared during weddings, harvest festivals, religious ceremonies, successful trading expeditions, and great communal feasts. Chiefs welcomed honored guests with mead. Victories were toasted with mead. Important agreements might even be sealed over shared drinking horns filled with the treasured beverage. Its rarity made it meaningful. If mead had been available every day, it would have lost much of its symbolic power. Instead, it remained something people looked forward to, an unmistakable sign that the occasion was worthy of celebration. The variety of Viking beverages reveals something important about their society. Each drink served a purpose. Water quenched thirst. Milk nourished growing bodies. Buttermilk prevented valuable dairy from being wasted. Light ale provided hydration, calories, and dependable refreshment. Mead marked life's happiest moments. Together, these drinks reflected a remarkably practical culture, one that valued usefulness above extravagance. Looking around the longhouse at the end of another busy day, one might see wooden cups resting beside bowls of steaming stew, slices of barley bread, smoked fish, and fresh butter. Children sip milk while listening to stories told by their grandparents. Adults enjoy light ale after hours of labor beneath the northern sky. Somewhere on a high shelf, carefully protected, sits a small container of precious honey waiting patiently for the next great celebration. It is a quiet reminder that the Vikings understood an enduring truth. Not every day should feel like a feast, because when ordinary days are lived with gratitude and careful preparation, the truly extraordinary moments become all the more memorable. And when the drinking horn filled with mead is finally raised, it is not merely a beverage being shared. It is the taste of a successful harvest, a healthy family, enduring friendships, and another winter survived together. For most of the year, a Viking family's meals were simple. Bowls of warm porridge greeted the morning. Fresh bread rested beside butter and cheese. Fish from the fjords, vegetables from the garden, and hearty stews simmering over the central hearth filled the evening table. These humble meals were not signs of poverty, they were the foundation of survival in a land where every season demanded careful planning. But every so often, ordinary life paused. The smoke rising from the longhouses grew thicker than usual. Neighbors arrived, carrying baskets of food. Children ran excitedly between the buildings while musicians tuned their instruments. The scent of roasting meat drifted through the crisp northern air, and drinking horns were carefully placed upon long wooden tables. A feast was about to begin. For the Vikings, feasts were far more than opportunities to eat well. They were moments when families, friendships, traditions, and entire communities were strengthened. One of the most celebrated occasions for a banquet came after victory. Popular culture often imagines Viking warriors returning from distant raids with ships overflowing with treasure. While reality was usually more complicated, successful military expeditions or victorious local conflicts were certainly reasons for celebration. When the warriors returned home safely, the village gathered. Roasted meat replaced the more familiar fish stew. Fresh bread was baked in greater quantities than usual. Ale flowed freely, and the precious stores of mead carefully saved for important occasions were finally brought out. The feast honored not only those who had fought, but also those who had waited. Families reunited after months apart. Stories of distant lands, dangerous storms, and narrow escapes were shared beside the fire. Young children listened with wide eyes as older warriors described places they had never seen. These stories became part of the community's memory. Not every feast, however, celebrated war. Some celebrated new beginnings. A Viking wedding was among the most important social events a community could experience. Marriage was not simply the union of two individuals. It often strengthened alliances between families, secured property, and reinforced bonds that could last for generations. Naturally, such an occasion demanded an unforgettable banquet. Guests traveled from neighboring settlements, sometimes journeying for days to attend. Long tables filled the great hall or the largest available longhouse. Bread, butter, smoked fish, roasted pork, beef, mutton, and fresh dairy products covered the tables. Seasonal vegetables accompanied rich stews, while honey-sweetened dishes appeared more frequently than they would during everyday meals. Music echoed through the hall. Poets recited heroic tales. Laughter filled the smoky room. The celebration often continued long into the night, and in some cases for several days, as guests honored the newly married couple with gifts, blessings, and shared meals. Perhaps no feast carried greater meaning than Yule. Long before Christmas became established across Scandinavia, the Norse celebrated the darkest time of the year with this great midwinter festival. Outside, snow covered the fields. The nights seemed endless. The sun appeared only briefly above the horizon, before disappearing once more into darkness. Yet inside the longhouse, warmth and light prevailed. The Yule feast marked both survival and hope. Families gathered around blazing fires while tables overflowed with the very foods they had spent months preserving. Roasted pork often took pride of place, as pigs had traditionally been slaughtered during autumn before winter fully arrived. Smoked and salted meats appeared alongside dried fish that had hung for months in coastal winds. Freshly baked barley bread accompanied bowls of butter and soft cheese, while preserved vegetables, peas, beans, and cabbage reminded everyone of the successful harvest that had made the feast possible. Every bite carried a story. Every dish represented careful preparation. Without the countless hours spent smoking fish, drying meat, storing grain, and preserving vegetables, there would have been no feast at all. And then there was the mead. Golden, fragrant, and sweet, mead appeared only because precious honey had been carefully saved throughout the year. Drinking horns were raised as families toasted the coming year, remembered ancestors, and honored the gods, or in later centuries, celebrated Christian holidays that gradually blended with older traditions. Mead was never simply a drink, it was a symbol. It represented abundance after hardship, celebration after labor, light after darkness. Yet perhaps the greatest importance of Viking feasts had little to do with food itself. The banquet served an essential social purpose. In a world without newspapers, telephones, or the internet, gatherings allowed news to travel from one settlement to another. Merchants exchanged information about distant markets. Farmers discussed harvests and weather. Marriages were arranged. Alliances were strengthened. Disputes could be settled through conversation rather than violence. Around the table, relationships were built. Hospitality also held enormous value. A generous host earned respect throughout the community. Sharing food demonstrated wealth, certainly, but even more importantly, it demonstrated honor. Offering guests the best available food showed that they were welcomed, trusted, and valued. To refuse hospitality without good reason could even be considered deeply disrespectful. Stories flourished during these evenings as well. Before books became common, history lived in memory. Elders recounted family histories stretching back generations. Skalds, Norse poets performed tales of legendary heroes, great voyages, and mythical gods. Young listeners absorbed these stories while sharing the same bread and ale as their parents and grandparents. In this way, feasts nourished not only the body, but also the culture itself. Looking back across the Viking Age, it becomes clear that these great banquets were never defined by extravagance alone. Their true importance came from everything they represented: months of careful farming, successful fishing expeditions, healthy livestock, well-stocked storage cellars, safe journeys home, strong friendships, growing families, a thriving community. For a few precious days, the worries of winter, hard labor, and uncertain weather faded into the background. The longhouse echoed with laughter instead of worry. The fire burned brighter. The tables stood fuller. And as drinking horns were raised beneath the smoke-darkened roof, every person present was reminded the greatest wealth a Viking could possess was not measured only in silver or treasure. It was measured in the people gathered together around the same table, sharing the same meal, and celebrating another season survived as one community. As dawn broke over the Norwegian fjords, the village slowly disappeared behind a curtain of mist. Longships slipped quietly away from the shore, their carved dragon heads pointing toward an endless horizon. The rhythmic splash of oars echoed across the calm water, while the sails, still hanging loose, waited for the first favorable wind. For the crew, the adventure had only just begun. Whether the voyage would last a few days along the coast or several weeks across the North Atlantic, every sailor knew one simple truth: the sea could not feed you every day. Despite their extraordinary reputation as fearless explorers, the Vikings did not simply set sail and hope to find food along the way. Successful voyages depended on careful preparation long before the ships ever left the harbor. Every meal eaten aboard had been planned, preserved, packed, and protected with remarkable care. A hungry crew could not row, an undernourished crew could not fight storms, and a starving crew would never reach distant shores. Among all the provisions loaded onto a Viking ship, one food appeared more consistently than any other: dried fish. Stockfish, especially dried cod, was almost the perfect food for life at sea. Weeks before departure, cod had been cleaned, split open, and hung on tall wooden racks overlooking the cold northern coast. There, the relentless wind slowly removed nearly all of its moisture. What remained was an incredibly hard but highly nutritious food that could last for months without spoiling. Its greatest advantage was durability. Unlike fresh meat or vegetables, dried fish required no cooking to remain edible and occupied very little space aboard the crowded ship. Before eating, sailors often softened it by soaking it in water or adding it to simmering stews whenever the opportunity arose. Sometimes, during particularly demanding journeys, pieces were simply chewed as they were, providing valuable protein even if the texture was as tough as wood. Alongside the stockfish hung another dependable companion: smoked meat. Pork was especially common because pigs were usually slaughtered during autumn, before winter feeding became difficult. Thick cuts of pork were carefully smoked over slow-burning fires until much of their moisture had disappeared. The result was food capable of surviving weeks at sea. Occasionally, smoked mutton, goat meat, or beef accompanied the crew as well, depending on what each household could spare before departure. Like the dried fish, smoked meat represented months of preparation compressed into a compact source of nourishment. Every bite reminded the sailors of the smokehouses they had left behind. Dairy products also found a place aboard the longship. Fresh milk, of course, would spoil within days. Hard cheese, however, was another matter entirely. Unlike soft cheeses eaten at home, firmer cheeses had been dried or aged to withstand long periods without refrigeration. Dense, nutritious, and surprisingly filling, they provided protein and healthy fats while requiring almost no preparation. A small piece of hard cheese eaten with bread could sustain a sailor through hours of rowing beneath cold northern skies. Bread itself traveled well, though not in the form most people imagine. The soft loaves that emerged fresh from baking stones inside the longhouse would never survive a lengthy voyage. Instead, Viking sailors often carried dense, dry barley or rye bread that had been baked specifically for storage. These hard loaves resisted mold far better than fresh bread and occupied relatively little space. Sometimes they were softened in soup or water before eating. At other times they were simply broken into smaller pieces and chewed slowly alongside cheese or smoked meat. It was not elegant, but it was dependable. Butter may seem like an unusual food to carry aboard a ship, yet it played an important role. Salted butter could remain edible for surprisingly long periods when stored carefully in tightly sealed wooden containers. Rich in calories and fat, it added flavor to otherwise plain meals while providing valuable energy for men who spent hour after hour rowing against wind and current. A little butter spread across coarse bread or stirred into a simple pot of porridge transformed an ordinary meal into something far more satisfying. Every calorie mattered. Life aboard a Viking ship demanded enormous physical effort. Then came one of the greatest challenges of every voyage: water. Fresh drinking water was absolutely essential, yet it was also difficult to preserve during long journeys. Water stored inside wooden barrels could gradually develop unpleasant tastes or become contaminated if not carefully managed. For shorter coastal voyages, crews often replenished their supplies whenever they landed near reliable streams or springs. Longer expeditions required more careful planning. Ships carried multiple barrels secured beneath benches where the rowing crew sat. Every sailor understood that fresh water was a precious resource and had to be used wisely. Alongside water, light ale frequently accompanied the voyage. Unlike strong alcoholic drinks, small ale contained relatively little alcohol and was commonly consumed as an everyday beverage. Because it had been brewed through boiling and fermentation, it often remained more stable than poorly stored water. It also supplied additional calories and nutrients from the grains used in brewing. Contrary to popular myth, Viking crews did not spend their voyages drunk. Crossing the North Atlantic demanded constant attention, quick judgment, and physical coordination. Every day ale was intended to nourish and hydrate rather than intoxicate. Packing enough food for an expedition required careful calculation. Before departure, every household contributing crew members also contributed supplies. Families knew approximately how much one person would consume each day, allowing leaders to estimate the provisions required for the planned journey. Barrels of dried fish, bundles of smoked meat, rounds of hard cheese, sacks of barley bread, containers of butter. Water and ale secured deep within the hull. Every item had to fit inside a vessel already crowded with weapons, tools, spare sails, ropes, trade goods, and the personal belongings of dozens of sailors. Space was precious. Nothing unnecessary was carried. Whenever possible, crews supplemented their stores along the way. Landing on friendly shores allowed them to catch fresh fish, collect shellfish, hunt birds, refill water barrels, or trade with local communities for additional food. These opportunities reduced pressure on the carefully packed supplies, while bringing welcome variety after weeks of preserved meals. Yet there were many days when the sea offered nothing but endless waves. Storms could prevent landing for days. Strong winds might drive ships far from familiar coastlines. Dense fog could delay progress. During such moments, the food packed before departure became the crew's greatest source of security. Looking back, it is tempting to admire the remarkable craftsmanship of Viking ships, or the courage of the sailors who crossed some of the world's most dangerous waters. But their greatest advantage was often much simpler: preparation. Every successful voyage began long before the sail caught the wind. It began in smokehouses where meat slowly cured over glowing embers. It began on coastal racks where cod dried beneath the Arctic breeze. It began inside longhouses where bread was baked, cheese was aged, butter was churned, and barrels were filled one careful layer at a time. Only because these ordinary tasks were performed with extraordinary care could Viking longships travel beyond the horizon, discover distant lands, and write their names into history. The sea tested every sailor. But it was the food packed aboard, quietly prepared by the hands waiting at home, that made those legendary journeys possible. For the Vikings, the year was not measured by calendars hanging on a wall or the turning of numbered pages. It was measured by the land. Every season brought new responsibilities, new opportunities, and new challenges. There was a time to sow, a time to fish, a time to harvest, a time to preserve, and a time to endure. If one part of the cycle failed, the entire year could unravel, leaving a family vulnerable long before winter came to an end. To survive in Scandinavia was to live in harmony with the seasons. Everything began with spring. After months of darkness, snow, and frozen earth, the first signs of warmer weather brought relief to every household. Streams began to flow again, patches of green slowly emerged beneath the melting snow, and livestock that had spent much of the winter sheltered indoors could finally return to the fields. Spring was a season of hope, but also of relentless work. Farmers repaired fences damaged by winter storms. Wooden plows were inspected, iron tools sharpened, and fields cleared of stones that frost had pushed to the surface. Every day mattered, because the growing season in Scandinavia was remarkably short. There was no time to waste. As soon as the soil became workable, families sowed barley, rye, and oats across their fields. Vegetable gardens were planted with cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, carrots, peas, and fava beans. Every member of the household contributed. Men plowed and prepared larger fields, while women and children often tended the gardens close to the longhouse. At the same time, newborn lambs, calves, and goat kids filled the farm with new life. Fresh milk returned after the lean winter months, allowing families to once again produce butter, cheese, and skyr in abundance. Spring was a season of beginnings. Every seed planted represented a promise. Every healthy animal offered hope for the months ahead. As spring faded into summer, the pace of life shifted once again. The days grew astonishingly long. In northern Scandinavia, sunlight lingered late into the evening, giving farmers precious extra hours to work. Fields demanded constant attention. Weeds had to be removed before they stole nutrients from valuable crops. Vegetable gardens required regular care, while hayfields became increasingly important. Hay was in many ways the hidden harvest. Throughout summer, families cut enormous quantities of grass, spreading it across open fields to dry beneath the sun before storing it inside barns. This hay would become the winter food for cattle, sheep, and goats. Without enough hay, livestock would perish long before spring returned. Every bundle carried into storage represented another chance for the animals and the family to survive. Summer also brought abundance from beyond the farm. Fishing reached its busiest season as calmer seas allowed boats to venture farther from shore. Wild berries began to ripen in the forests. Fresh herbs scented the air, while mushrooms appeared after warm rains. Children often joined their parents gathering these seasonal gifts, learning to recognize edible plants while filling baskets with food that would later be preserved. For a brief moment, the Viking table became richer than at any other time of the year. Then came autumn. If spring symbolized hope, autumn represented reward. Golden grain fields stretched across the landscape, ready for harvest. Entire families worked from dawn until dusk cutting barley, rye, and oats with iron sickles before binding them into sheaves. Every grain mattered. A sudden storm or an early frost could destroy months of labor almost overnight. Once safely harvested, the grain was carried into storage buildings where it would remain dry until needed throughout the coming year. The vegetable gardens also reached their peak. Cabbages were harvested. Turnips were pulled from the earth. Peas and fava beans were dried. Onions and leeks were bundled together and hung beneath the rafters. The forests offered one final gift: hazelnuts, wild apples, and late-season berries filled baskets before disappearing with the first frosts. Yet autumn was not only a season of gathering, it was also the time for difficult decisions. As winter approached, families carefully counted their livestock. Keeping every animal alive required enormous quantities of stored hay. Often there simply was not enough. Some animals would have to be slaughtered before the snow arrived. It was a practical necessity rather than a celebration. Pigs were commonly butchered in late autumn, as they had spent the warmer months feeding themselves in nearby forests. Older cattle, sheep, or goats that could no longer produce milk or wool were also selected. Nothing went to waste. Fresh meat briefly appeared on the table before the long process of preservation began. Smokehouses filled with pork, mutton and beef. Fish continued drying beside the coast. Butter was salted. Cheese matured. Vegetables disappeared into underground storage cellars. Every family worked with remarkable urgency because they all understood the same truth. Winter was coming. Then, at last, the land fell silent. Winter transformed Scandinavia into an entirely different world. The fields lay buried beneath snow. The vegetable gardens disappeared beneath frozen ground. The forests became quiet, and many animals retreated until spring. Outside, food could no longer be relied upon. Inside the longhouse, however, the success or failure of the previous year's work became visible every single day. Barrels of dried fish stood beside smoked meat. Sacks of barley and oats lined the walls. Cheese aged quietly on wooden shelves. Turnips, cabbage, onions, and apples rested in cool storage pits. Butter waited inside sealed containers. Every meal served throughout winter was, in reality, a meal prepared months earlier. The Viking family now lived from its own foresight. Winter was also the season of repair. Fishing nets were mended. Wooden tools were replaced. Clothing was woven from wool sheared during the summer. Children listened as elders shared stories around the fire, passing on the knowledge that would one day guide another generation through the same cycle. There was little farming to do. Instead, there was preparation for the spring that everyone hoped would return. Looking across the entire year, one thing becomes remarkably clear. The Viking diet was never shaped by a single harvest or a single season. It was shaped by an unbroken cycle of planning, labor, and patience. Spring demanded faith. Summer required endurance. Autumn rewarded effort. Winter tested every decision that had come before. Each season depended upon the last, and each prepared the way for the next. This rhythm governed every Viking household for generations. It determined when bread was baked, when fish were dried, when livestock were slaughtered, when vegetables were harvested, and when precious stores could finally be opened. Long before the Vikings became famous as fearless sailors and explorers, they were masters of something even more fundamental. They had learned how to live in harmony with one of the harshest climates in Europe, and perhaps that was their greatest achievement of all. Not conquering the land, but understanding it well enough that, year after year, it allowed them to survive. For much of the year, the Viking table reflected the landscape that surrounded it: dark barley bread, smoked fish, fresh dairy, root vegetables, wild berries gathered from nearby forests. These were the foods that sustained ordinary families through the changing seasons. They were practical, nourishing, and deeply connected to the Scandinavian countryside. Yet every so often, something extraordinary appeared: a small cloth bag tied with foreign rope, a fragile clay jar sealed with wax, a wooden chest containing unfamiliar aromas, or perhaps a glass bottle filled with a drink unlike anything produced in the north. These rare treasures had traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles before reaching a Viking longhouse. They were reminders that the Viking world was never isolated. Although often remembered as fearless warriors, the Vikings were equally remarkable merchants. Their ships sailed not only to raid distant shores but also to trade across an enormous network, stretching from the icy North Atlantic to the bustling markets of the Byzantine Empire and the rich commercial cities of the Middle East. Wherever they traveled, they encountered new flavors. And sometimes they brought those flavors home. Among the most prized imports were spices. Today, a kitchen shelf may hold dozens of jars containing pepper, cinnamon, cloves, cumin, or saffron. In the Viking Age, such spices were astonishingly rare in Scandinavia. Black pepper, for example, originated in India before passing through long chains of merchants across Asia and Europe. Every stage of that journey increased its value. By the time a few precious peppercorns reached a northern trading settlement such as Hedeby or Birka, they had become symbols of wealth rather than everyday ingredients. Only the richest households could afford them. A pinch of imported spice might flavor a feast prepared for honored guests or celebrate an important festival. Ordinary families, meanwhile, continued relying on onions, leeks, juniper, wild thyme, and other local herbs to season their meals. The contrast was striking. One flavor came from the nearby forest, the other had crossed continents. Wine represented another extraordinary luxury. Scandinavia's cool climate made large-scale grape cultivation nearly impossible, so true grape wine could not be produced locally. Instead, every bottle had to arrive aboard merchant ships traveling from regions such as Francia, the Rhineland, or farther south through European trade networks. Unlike ale or mead, wine remained a drink of prestige. Powerful chieftains served it to distinguished visitors. Successful merchants displayed it during important gatherings. Possessing imported wine signaled not only wealth, but also extensive trading connections beyond Scandinavia. Drinking wine became a way of demonstrating that one's world extended far beyond the fjords. Another imported delicacy surprised many northern travelers: almonds. Today they appear in supermarkets across the world, but during the Viking Age, almonds were exotic treasures grown in much warmer climates around the Mediterranean. Small, nutritious, and easy to transport, almonds survived long journeys surprisingly well. They may have been eaten as rare snacks, added to festive meals, or presented as valuable gifts among wealthy families. Their very presence on a Viking table hinted at commercial relationships stretching across Europe. Dried fruit so transformed northern diets. Fresh grapes, figs, dates, raisins, and other fruits from warmer lands could never survive the journey north in their natural state. Once dried, however, they became remarkably durable. Merchants carried them across rivers, mountain passes, and seas until they finally reached Scandinavian markets. To Viking families accustomed to tart wild berries and small forest apples, these imported fruits must have seemed wonderfully sweet. Children may have regarded them as extraordinary treats. Adults likely reserved them for celebrations or important guests. Unlike everyday foods harvested from nearby fields, dried fruits represented the taste of distant sunshine carried across continents. These remarkable luxuries did not appear by magic. They traveled through one of the most extensive trade networks of the early medieval world. Viking merchants sailed west to the British Isles and Ireland. They crossed the North Sea into the Frankish kingdoms. They followed the great rivers of Eastern Europe, including the Dnieper and the Volga, linking Scandinavia with the Byzantine Empire and the vast trading cities of the Islamic world. Along these routes flowed an astonishing variety of goods. Silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, silks from the East, fine glassware, jewelry, ceramics, spices, wines, dried fruit. Every marketplace introduced new products, new customs, and new ideas. In return, Viking traders offered furs, walrus ivory, amber, iron, timber, crafted goods, and sometimes enslaved people. A tragic but historically significant part of Viking commerce that reflected the harsh realities of the era. Trade changed more than wealth. It changed taste. A Viking returning from Constantinople, or Miklagaard, as the Norse called it, have encountered bustling markets overflowing with unfamiliar foods, colorful spices, fragrant oils, and luxurious delicacies unlike anything found in Scandinavia. Those experiences expanded expectations. While ordinary meals at home remained rooted in local traditions, imported ingredients gradually introduced subtle new flavors into elite households. The Viking palate became broader, because the Viking world became larger. Archaeology provides fascinating evidence for these connections. Excavations at important Viking trading centers have uncovered peppercorns preserved for more than 1,000 years. Fragments of imported wine vessels have been discovered far from Mediterranean vineyards. Exotic plant remains, foreign ceramics, and luxury tableware all reveal that Scandinavian society participated in commercial networks reaching astonishing distances. These discoveries remind us that globalization is not purely a modern phenomenon. Even 1,000 years ago, ideas and flavors traveled remarkable distances. Yet despite these luxuries, everyday life changed very little for most people. The average Viking farmer still began the morning with porridge. Bread remained the foundation of nearly every meal. Fish, dairy, vegetables, and preserved foods continued to sustain families through long winters. Imported delicacies never replaced local traditions. Instead, they complemented them. A few peppercorns might season a festive roast. A cup of wine might honor a distinguished guest. A handful of raisins might brighten a Yule celebration. These small additions brought the wider world into the longhouse without changing the practical wisdom that had sustained Viking communities for centuries. Perhaps that is what makes Viking trade so remarkable. The Norse did not abandon their identity when they encountered foreign cultures. They remained deeply connected to the land and sea that had shaped them. At the same time, they welcomed new experiences, new goods, and new flavors from places they could scarcely have imagined as children. Every imported spice, every almond, every dried fig, and every bottle of wine told a story, not merely of commerce, but of curiosity, of courage, of ships sailing beyond familiar horizons, and of a civilization whose appetite extended far beyond the food on its table, reaching instead toward the vast and interconnected world waiting beyond the northern seas. Close your eyes and picture a Viking meal. What do you see? For many people, the image is almost identical. A great wooden hall echoes with laughter as fierce warriors tear into enormous roasted legs of meat. Drinking horns overflow with mead. Bones are tossed onto the floor while endless feasting continues late into the night. It is a powerful image. But it is also one of the greatest misconceptions about Viking life. The truth, revealed through archaeology, historical writings, and the remains of ancient settlements, paints a far more interesting picture. Far from living on endless banquets of meat and alcohol, most Vikings followed a practical, remarkably balanced diet shaped by the seasons, the land, and the constant need to prepare for the future. Perhaps the biggest myth of all is that Vikings ate meat every day. It is easy to understand why this idea became so popular. Epic stories naturally focus on celebrations, victories, and royal feasts, rather than ordinary family dinners. Movies and television prefer dramatic roasting spits over bowls of cabbage soup, because spectacle captures attention more easily than routine. Yet everyday life was rarely spectacular. For most Viking families, meat was too valuable to consume casually. A living cow produced milk every day. A sheep provided wool year after year. A goat climbed rocky hillsides while supplying fresh dairy. Even pigs, raised primarily for meat, were usually slaughtered only during the autumn, when winter approached and feeding large numbers of animals became impractical. Fresh meat was therefore associated with specific seasons, festivals, weddings, or other important occasions. The ordinary evening meal looked very different. More often than not, bread, fish, vegetables, dairy products, and hearty stews formed the foundation of the family table. Another widespread myth concerns mead. Ask almost anyone what Vikings drank, and the answer usually comes immediately: mead. Golden honey wine has become almost inseparable from Viking culture and popular imagination. Countless illustrations depict warriors raising drinking horns filled with the legendary beverage before sailing into battle or celebrating another successful voyage. There is some truth behind the image. Mead certainly existed. It was admired, respected, and closely associated with important ceremonies. But it was never an everyday drink for most people. Honey itself was a precious resource. Gathering it required considerable effort, and the amount available each year remained limited. Because of its value, families used honey carefully, sweetening special dishes, preserving fruit, or fermenting only enough made for significant celebrations. Ordinary days belonged to simpler beverages: fresh water, milk, buttermilk, and light ale brewed from barley. These drinks sustained daily life far more often than mead ever did. A third misconception is perhaps even more surprising. Many people assume that vegetables played only a minor role in Viking cooking. The opposite is true. Archaeological evidence from Viking farms has revealed the widespread cultivation of cabbage, onion, leeks, turnips, peas, beans, carrots, and numerous herbs. These vegetables appeared regularly in soups, stews, and everyday meals. Beyond the gardens, forests supplied berries, mushrooms, hazelnuts, apples, and medicinal plants that enriched the diet even further. Vegetables were not decorative side dishes, they were essential. They supplied important nutrients throughout the year, especially when preserved foods became the primary source of nourishment during winter. Equally misunderstood is the importance of grain. If modern stories emphasize meat, Viking reality centered on bread and porridge. Barley, rye, and oats appeared in nearly every household. These grains became dense loaves baked on hot stones, thick porridge eaten each morning, and nourishing soups that could feed an entire family. Grain represented stability. Unlike hunting, which depended on luck, or fishing, which depended on weather, carefully stored grain provided predictable nourishment throughout much of the year. Without barley fields and rye harvests, Viking society could never have supported its growing population or financed long voyages across Europe. Fish, too, deserves far greater recognition than it usually receives. For communities living beside Norway's endless coastline, cod, herring, and salmon were among the most dependable foods available. Fresh fish appeared whenever possible. Smoked fish filled smokehouses. Dried cod accompanied sailors across the North Atlantic. In many coastal settlements, fish almost certainly appeared on the table more often than meat. It was affordable, nutritious, and remarkably easy to preserve. Perhaps the greatest surprise is how balanced the Viking diet actually was. Without understanding calories, vitamins, proteins, or minerals, Viking families gradually developed eating habits that modern nutritionists would recognize as remarkably sensible. Whole grains supplied lasting energy. Fish provided high-quality protein and healthy fats. Dairy contributed calcium and additional protein. Vegetables and wild berries offered vitamins and fiber. Beans and peas added valuable plant protein. Nuts supplied healthy oils and calories. Even fermented foods such as skyr and cultured dairy products supported digestion in ways the Vikings could never have scientifically explained. Their meals were not designed by physicians. They were refined by centuries of experience. Generation after generation discovered what worked. Foods that sustained healthy families were passed down. Methods that reduced waste survived. Preservation techniques improved. Knowledge accumulated quietly around the hearth rather than inside books. Of course, the Viking diet was not perfect. Harvest failures could lead to hunger. Long winters tested food supplies. Poor families often had less variety than wealthy households. Imported luxuries remained beyond the reach of most people. Yet despite these limitations, Viking communities built one of the most resilient food cultures of the medieval world. Their success came not from abundance but from adaptability. Looking back across the centuries, perhaps the greatest myth is not about meat or mead at all. It is the idea that Vikings lived recklessly. The evidence suggests something very different. Their food reflects careful planning rather than excess. Preservation instead of waste. Seasonal eating instead of constant abundance. Practical choices instead of extravagant indulgence. The legendary warriors who crossed oceans and explored distant lands were sustained not by endless feasts, but by ordinary meals prepared with extraordinary wisdom. In the end, the Viking table tells a quieter story than the sagas. Yet it may also tell a more important one. Because the true strength of the Norse people was not found only in their ships, their swords, or their courage. It was found in their ability to feed a family through the longest winters, make the most of every harvest, and transform the harsh landscape of Scandinavia into a source of lasting nourishment. That perhaps was the greatest feast of all. As the first rays of the morning sun shimmer across the still waters of a Scandinavian fjord, a single Viking longship silently toward the open sea. Its sail catches the northern wind, carrying its crew beyond familiar coastlines and toward lands they have never seen before. History often remembers these voyages for their courage, for their ships, for their fearless sailors. But behind every successful expedition stood something far less dramatic. A well-fed crew. Long before a Viking could cross the North Atlantic, explore Iceland, settle Greenland, or reach the shores of North America, he first had to survive countless ordinary days at home. The strength that pushed heavy oars through icy waters was not created overnight. It was built slowly, meal after meal, season after season. The Viking diet was never designed to impress. It was designed to endure. Whole grains provided steady energy for long hours of farming, rowing, and construction. Fish supplied abundant protein and healthy fats from the rich northern seas. Dairy products strengthened growing bodies, while vegetables, legumes, and wild plants added essential nutrients throughout the changing seasons. Without realizing it, Viking families had created a diet perfectly suited to the demands of their world. Every bowl of barley porridge prepared a child for years of physical labor. Every piece of dried cod strengthened the sailor who would later cross unknown oceans. Every cup of milk, every slice of rye bread, every serving of cabbage or peas quietly contributed to a civilization famous for its endurance. Even the methods used to preserve food helped shape history. Smokehouses, drying racks, salted barrels, fermented dairy, and underground storage cellars allowed communities to store enough provisions to survive harsh winters and support long-distance voyages. Exploration was only possible because food could travel. A ship filled with brave men, but empty barrels would never have reached Iceland. A crew without preserved fish or hard bread would have turned back long before Greenland appeared on the horizon. In many ways, Viking exploration began not at the harbor, but inside the family longhouse. Centuries have passed since the Viking Age came to an end, yet many of its foods remain remarkably familiar across Scandinavia today. Walk into a bakery in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, or Iceland, and you will still find dark rye bread that reflects traditions more than 1,000 years old. Visit a coastal village, and dried cod continues to be prepared using techniques that would have been instantly recognizable to Viking fishermen. Skyr, once an everyday dairy food in Norse households, remains especially beloved in Iceland, where its thick, creamy texture still makes it a staple of the modern diet. Smoked salmon has become one of Scandinavia's most famous exports, while pickled and preserved herring continues to appear on festive tables throughout the Nordic countries. Even simple ingredients such as cabbage, root vegetables, oats, barley, and fresh dairy products continue to define much of Northern European cooking. Modern kitchens may contain electric ovens, refrigerators, and advanced technology, but many traditional recipes still reflect the wisdom of generations who learned to cook with the seasons rather than against them. Perhaps this is the greatest legacy of Viking food. It teaches us that sustainability is not a modern invention. The Vikings wasted very little because they could not afford to. Every harvest was carefully stored. Every animal provided multiple resources. Fish were preserved instead of discarded. Wild berries were gathered when abundant. Herbs were collected not only for flavor but also for health. The rhythm of nature guided every decision. Today many Nordic chefs proudly embrace these same principles: seasonal ingredients, local farms, wild foraging, simple preparation that allows natural flavors to shine. What the world now celebrates as the new Nordic cuisine echoes practices that Viking families understood centuries ago. Fresh ingredients, respect for nature, minimal waste, patience. These ideas are surprisingly ancient. Of course, modern Scandinavian cuisine has evolved dramatically through centuries of international trade and cultural exchange. Potatoes, tomatoes, cockleat, and countless other ingredients arrived long after the Viking Age. Yet beneath these changes, the foundation remains unmistakably familiar. The sea still provides. The forests still offer berries and mushrooms. The fields still produce rye, oats, and barley. The dairy farms still shape daily life across much of the region. In this way, the Viking table never truly disappeared. It simply evolved. Looking back across this journey, one truth becomes wonderfully clear. The story of Viking food is not really about food alone. It is the story of resilience. Of families who learned to thrive where winters were long and harvests were short. Of farmers who transformed rocky landscapes into productive fields. Of fishermen who trusted the sea while respecting its dangers. Of mothers and fathers who spent entire summers preparing meals for winters that had not yet arrived. It is also the story of exploration. Because every loaf of barley bread packed aboard a long ship, every piece of smoked pork hanging inside a storage chest, every wheel of hard cheese, every bundle of dried fish, and every barrel of fresh water carried something far greater than nourishment. They carried possibility. Without them, the Vikings would never have reached Iceland. They would never have settled Greenland. They would never have stood upon the distant shores of Vinland, centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Their legendary voyages were powered not only by wind filling their sails, but by generations of practical knowledge passed quietly from one family to the next. So the next time you imagine the Viking Age, perhaps picture something different. Not only roaring warriors raising drinking horns beneath blazing fires, but a quiet longhouse at sunrise, fresh bread cooling beside the hearth, a pot of porridge gently simmering over glowing embers, children carrying buckets of milk, fish hanging to dry in the northern breeze, a family preparing for another season together. Because in the end, the greatest achievement of Viking food was not creating unforgettable feasts. It was creating people strong enough to build one of history's greatest ages of exploration, one simple meal at a time. As night falls across the Scandinavian fjords, the Viking village grows quiet once again. The last fishing boats have been pulled ashore, livestock rest safely inside their shelters, and a blanket of stars slowly spreads across the northern sky. Inside the longhouse, the fire still burns. Its warm glow dances across timber walls darkened by years of smoke, while family members gather shoulder to shoulder around the hearth. There is no lavish banquet tonight. Instead, a simple meal waits on the table: fresh barley bread, slices of dried fish softened in a hearty stew, a little butter, perhaps some cheese, and bowls of warm porridge shared among those who work the land and sea together. It is a humble meal. Yet it tells the true story of the Viking world. The strength of the Norse did not come only from sharp swords, sturdy shields, or the legendary longships that carried them across unknown oceans. It was built quietly, day after day, through the hands that sowed barley in the spring, gathered berries in the summer, harvested crops in the autumn, and carefully preserved every precious bite before winter arrived. Their greatest weapon was often preparation. Their greatest victory was survival. Every loaf of coarse barley bread represented months of patient labor. Every piece of dried cod reflected the generosity of the northern seas, and the wisdom to preserve it for tomorrow. Every bowl of porridge, every wheel of cheese, every pot of simmering stew reminded Viking families that resilience begins not on the battlefield, but around the dinner table. These ordinary meals became the extraordinary foundation of an age of exploration. They nourished the sailors who crossed the North Atlantic, the farmers who transformed rocky landscapes into thriving communities, and the families whose knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. Long before the Vikings became legends, they first learned how to feed themselves in one of Europe's harshest environments, and that achievement made every voyage possible. Thank you for spending this evening with Chronicles Chronicles. If you enjoyed this journey into the everyday life of the Vikings, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more relaxing historical stories from civilizations around the world. And as the fire slowly fades into glowing embers, leaving only the gentle sound of the wind beyond the longhouse walls, we leave you with one final thought. If you could sit down for one evening in a Viking longhouse, what meal would you choose to taste first?